The storm was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Wind screamed around the house and the rain battered the windows like a relentless assault. I huddled with my wife, Sarah, and our daughter, Emily, in the living room. The power had gone out hours ago, and the only light came from the flickering flames in the fireplace. Shadows danced on the walls, twisted and eerie in the intermittent flashes of lightning. Emily clutched her teddy bear, her eyes wide with fear. I tried to soothe her with gentle words, assuring her that it was just a storm, but even as I spoke, I could feel my own nerves fraying. I had seen something earlier just for a moment, a shadow flitting past the window. At first I dismissed it, blaming it on the storm or my overactive imagination. But the image clung to me, gnawing at my thoughts. Another crash of thunder shook the house and I heard it, a creak from upstairs. It was so faint I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it. But then it came again, louder this time. My stomach tightened. We were alone in the house. There was no one else who could have made that sound. I exchanged a look with Sarah. Her eyes were wide, mirroring the dread that had taken root in my chest. Something was wrong. I couldn't just sit there and ignore it. "Stay here," I whispered to her, gripping the poker from the fireplace. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was better than nothing. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to stay put, to protect my family by keeping them close. But I couldn't leave that sound unexplored, not with Emily in the house. I moved towards the stairs, each step like wading through molasses. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, as if it were trying to drown out the noise of my footsteps. The air was thick with tension, pressing down on me as I climbed. Lightning flashed, and the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe with malevolent life. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The house was silent now, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the world were holding its breath. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my blood rushing in my ears. I moved down the hallway, every door a black void of uncertainty. Emily's room was first. I nudged the door open with the poker, half expecting to find some horror lurking inside. But it was empty, just as we had left it. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. A muffled thump came from behind me. I spun around, the poker raised, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the doorway of our bedroom, was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, and gaunt. The figure was barely more than a silhouette, but its eyes glinted in the darkness with an unnatural light. The sight of it rooted me to the spot. The poker shook in my hands, my muscles locked in terror. It took a step forward, and I swore the darkness around it deepened, swallowing the light from the lightning flash that illuminated the hallway. My scream lodged in my throat, strangled by fear. It moved closer, and I felt an overwhelming dread that threatened to drown me. This wasn't just a stranger in our home. It was something else, something wrong. I could feel its malevolence, a dark, suffocating presence that filled the space around it. In a desperate burst of adrenaline, I swung the poker at it. The metal passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke, and it vanished, dissipating into the shadows. I stood there, panting, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. The hallway was empty now, the oppressive feeling lifting slightly, but the fear remained. I backed away, not daring to turn my back on the hallway as I descended the stairs. Sarah's worried face greeted me, and I shook my head, unsure of how to explain what I'd seen. I wasn't sure I even believed it myself. But the night wasn't over. We sat in the living room, every creak and groan of the house setting me on edge. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling as if in pain. And then above the noise of the storm, I heard it again. Footsteps on the stairs. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound was deliberate, heavy, and approaching. I rose slowly, my muscles tensed, the poker gripped tightly in my hand once more. Sarah's eyes were wide with fear, and I could see the terror mirrored in Emily's innocent face. The footsteps continued, each one sending a jolt of fear through my body. The figure appeared at the top of the stairs, just as before. But this time it did not pause. It began to descend, one slow, deliberate step at a time. I stepped in front of my family, the poker raised again, though I knew it would do no good. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, its glowing eyes fixed on me. There was an intelligence there, a cold, malevolent awareness that chilled me to the bone. It began to move toward us, and the air grew colder, the light from the fireplace dimming as if being drained. I could feel the life being sucked out of the room, as if the very essence of the house was being consumed by this thing. In a final act of desperation, I threw the poker at it. The figure did not flinch as the metal passed through it, clattering uselessly to the floor. It continued its approach, and I felt a cold hand grip my heart, squeezing the life from it. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It stood there for a moment, as if considering us, and then it turned and moved back towards the stairs. The darkness seemed to follow it, retreating up the steps, until it disappeared from view. The storm began to subside, the wind dying down and the rain lessening to a soft patter. The power flickered back on, the lights casting a warm, familiar glow over the room. But the warmth did nothing to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. We didn't speak of it, not that night, not ever. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. That figure, whatever it was, would return. It was waiting, biding its time, and when it came back, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stop it. The house, once a haven, had become a place of dread. The shadows seemed to linger a little longer, and the darkness felt a little thicker. And in the quiet moments, when the house was still, I could swear I heard footsteps on the stairs, growing closer and closer. The forest had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the clamor of the city and lose myself in nature's embrace. When I set out that afternoon, the sun had cast a golden hue over everything, and the trees had welcomed me like old friends. The scent of pine and earth filled my lungs as I hiked deeper into the woods, each step taking me further from civilization. I felt invincible, as if nothing could go wrong in this place that had always been so kind to me. But now, hours later, that sense of invincibility had crumbled to dust. The storm had come out of nowhere, a sudden fury that turned the tranquil forest into a nightmarish landscape. Rain lashed at me, drenching my clothes and making every step a struggle. The trails I knew so well had vanished beneath torrents of muddy water, leaving me disoriented and lost. The wind roared through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something that smelled like fear. I pushed on, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The storm was relentless, as if the forest itself had decided to expel me. The wind's howl sounded almost like voices, screaming for me to leave. Lightning cracked overhead, momentarily illuminating the twisted branches that loomed like skeletal fingers, grasping at the sky. The sight sent shivers down my spine, but I forced myself to keep moving. I needed to find shelter before the storm consumed me entirely. Then, through the sheets of rain, I saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance. It was like a beacon of hope in the otherwise impenetrable darkness. My heart leaped in my chest, and I quickened my pace, desperate to reach the source of the light. As I drew closer, The light resolved into a small, dilapidated cabin, barely visible through the downpour. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, the wood weathered and the roof sagging. Something about the cabin felt wrong, but I was too cold and wet to care. I needed to get out of the storm, if only for a moment. I approached cautiously, lifting my hand to knock on the door. But before my knuckles could make contact, the door creaked open on its own, as if it had been waiting for me. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by a flickering oil lamp that cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. The air inside was thick and oppressive, carrying the smell of damp wood and something else, something faintly sweet and metallic that made my stomach twist in knots. At a rickety table sat a man, his back to me. He was tall and thin, his clothes dark and nondescript. He sat perfectly still, as if he hadn't noticed me, or as if he had been waiting for me all along. "Well, come in, the man said, his voice calm and welcoming, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. "You can't stay out there in this weather. The storm is only getting worse." His words were inviting, but they did nothing to soothe the growing unease gnawing at me. There was something about his demeanor that set off alarm bells in my mind, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but the lure of shelter was too strong. I stepped inside, muttering a word of thanks as the door creaked shut behind me. The man turned slowly, almost deliberately, and for a moment it felt as though the shadows in the room moved with him, closing in tighter around us. When his face came into view, my breath caught in my throat. He was smiling, but there was nothing kind or reassuring in that smile. It was a cold, hollow expression that sent a chill through me, as if the very warmth had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to leave, to turn and bolt out the door, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The man's eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a strange, unnatural calm settle over me, like a heavy blanket smothering my fear. He gestured to the chair across from him, his smile never wavering. "Sit down, won't you? You must be exhausted." I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to get out. But my body moved of its own accord. I lowered myself into the chair, my movements slow and mechanical. The man nodded approvingly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice soft and almost soothing, like the lullaby of a predator to its prey. "You must be wondering why you're here." My mind was a whirl of confusion and terror, but I couldn't speak. It was as if the words were trapped in my throat, choked off by an invisible hand. "You see," the man continued, leaning forward slightly, "this storm isn't just a storm. It's a test, a trial, if you will, to see if you're worthy." "Worthy of what?" I finally managed to croak out, my voice sounding foreign and distant. The man's smile widened, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the shadows behind him, something that didn't belong in this world. His eyes seemed to glow with a faint, otherworldly light as he spoke. "Worthy of the truth about this forest, about the world you thought you knew." He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Most who venture into these woods never find their way out. They become part of the forest, lost in its endless maze. But you might just have what it takes to survive." A sudden, sharp pain shot through my head, and I doubled over, clutching at my temples. The cabin seemed to tilt and spin around me, the shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. The man's voice echoed in my mind, a low, insistent whisper that burrowed deep into my thoughts. "Do you feel it? The pull of the forest? It's calling to you, trying to claim you, but you must resist. If you want to survive, you have to fight it. I forced myself to sit up, gasping for breath as the pain subsided. The man was still watching me, his smile replaced by a look of intense focus. "Remember this," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "The forest is alive. It sees you, it hears you, and it knows your deepest fears. If you give in, if you let it take you, you'll never leave." Before I could respond, the cabin door flew open with a crash, and the storm surged in, the wind howling like a wild beast. The man stood up abruptly, his expression one of grim determination. "It's time," he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "You have to go now. You have to find your way out before it's too late." I stumbled to my feet, the urge to flee overwhelming me. But before I could move, the man grabbed my arm, his grip cold and unyielding. "Remember," he said urgently, his eyes boring into mine. "The forest is watching. Don't let it take you." And then he shoved me out the door, into the storm. The wind tore at me as I staggered away from the cabin, the man's warning echoing in my mind. The forest loomed around me, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky. The path was gone, swallowed by the mud and rain, and I was left to navigate the labyrinth of trees on my own. Every step felt like a battle, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The man's words played over and over in my head. "The forest is watching. Don't let it take you." The shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, creeping closer with every second. The wind carried strange whispers, voices that urged me to stop, to rest, to give up. But I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, to find my way out before the forest claimed me. The rain lashed at my face, blinding me, but I pressed on, driven by sheer terror. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. I could feel the forest's gaze on me, a heavy, suffocating presence that threatened to crush me. But then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. It was the first sign of hope I'd seen since I'd left the cabin, and I forced my weary legs to carry me toward it. As I drew closer, the glow grew brighter, and I realized it was coming from the edge of the forest. The trees thinned, and I stumbled out into a clearing, the storm finally beginning to abate. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the memory of the cabin and the man still fresh in my mind. I didn't know if I had truly escaped the forest's grip, or if I had merely traded one nightmare for another. But for now, I was free. Or so I thought. Rain lashed against the windshield, turning the desolate highway ahead into a blur of red and white streaks. It felt like the storm was alive, each drop hammering down with a purpose, trying to keep me from my destination. The rhythmic swish of the wipers did little to ease the growing knot of anxiety in my gut. Something was wrong. I could feel it, like a chill that crept into my bones and refused to leave. I should have stayed at the diner. The warmth, the light, the smell of coffee, it all seemed like a distant memory now, swallowed by the storm. But the road called to me, like it always did, whispering promises of adventure, of the unknown, and I was powerless to resist. The downpour intensified, and the world outside my car became a swirling vortex of water and shadows. It was as if the storm was trying to consume me, to drag me into its dark heart. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my eyes darting between the road and the mirrors, searching for any sign of danger. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind carried with it a whisper of something sinister. That's when I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, a figure huddled by the side of the road, a splash of red in the monochrome world. Her raincoat was vibrant, almost too bright against the gray storm. like a beacon calling out to me. She stood there, her thumb extended in the universal plea for a ride. For a moment I hesitated. I'd heard the stories, the legends about this stretch of highway, the whispers of vanished hitchhikers and ghostly apparitions. But the look in her posture, the way she stood there, vulnerable and alone, pulled at something deep within me. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The roar of the storm filled the car as I rolled down the window, the cold wind and rain slapping me in the face. "Get in!" I yelled over the noise, my voice barely carrying through the storm. She didn't hesitate. In an instant, she was inside, the door slamming shut behind her, cutting off the howling wind. The scent of rain filled the car, mingling with something else, something floral and oddly out of place. It was a smell that didn't belong here, like it had come from another time, another world. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "You're a lifesaver." Her words were sincere, but there was something off about them, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at her, trying to make out her features under the hood of her red raincoat. Her face was partially obscured, but her eyes, those eyes, were dark, almost black, and they seemed to reflect the faint red glow of the dashboard. They looked at me, through me, as if they were searching for something hidden deep within my soul. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the heavy silence that had settled between us. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. "West," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Just west." Her answer was vague, almost as if she didn't know herself. I tried to engage her in conversation, but her responses were distant, evasive, like talking to a shadow. The storm raged on outside, but inside the car, a different kind of storm was brewing. An unsettling disquiet had taken root in my mind, growing with each passing mile. Something wasn't right. I glanced at her again, intending to ask more about where she was going, but the words died in my throat. She was gone. The passenger seat was empty. My heart skipped a beat, then began to race. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt in the middle of the highway. I turned, my eyes wide with disbelief, staring at the empty seat where she had been just moments before. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she jumped out? No, that was impossible. I would have heard the door open. She couldn't have just disappeared. But she had. The only trace of her was the lingering scent of rain and that faint, floral fragrance. I sat there, frozen, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. The storm outside seemed to have grown louder, more violent, as if it was mocking me, laughing at my confusion. I needed to get out of there. I needed to drive, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I started to pull away, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. A flash of red. I glanced up, my blood running cold. There she was, standing in the middle of the road behind me, her red raincoat glowing like a beacon in the darkness. I slammed on the brakes again, my heart pounding in my ears. I turned to look back, but she was gone. The road was empty, nothing but the pouring rain and the dark, wet asphalt. I was losing my mind. I had to be. There was no other explanation. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there in the storm, waiting. I drove on, my eyes constantly flicking to the mirrors, half expecting to see her again. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of darkness and rain. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, fear and confusion warring with each other. But one thing was clear. I wasn't alone. Something was with me, something that didn't belong in this world. As the miles passed, I began to notice things. The shadows seemed to shift, to move in ways they shouldn't. The rain, which had been a constant roar, began to take on a rhythm, almost like a voice, whispering, chanting. And then there were the flashes of red, just at the edge of my vision, always gone when I turned to look. I started to see her everywhere, in the trees that lined the road, in the rearview mirror, in the flashes of lightning that lit up the sky. She was there, watching me, following me. The tension in the car was unbearable, the air thick with fear and something else, something ancient and malevolent. I drove faster, desperate to escape. But no matter how far I went, she was always there, just out of reach, just beyond the edge of my vision. The storm raged on, the road stretching out endlessly before me, and I began to wonder if I would ever escape, if I would ever find my way out of this nightmare. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm broke. The rain stopped, the clouds parted, and the moon shone down, illuminating the road ahead. But the relief I felt was short-lived. As the last of the storm clouds drifted away, I saw her again, standing in the middle of the road, her red raincoat glowing in the moonlight. I swerved to avoid her, the car skidding off the road, into the ditch. My head hit the steering wheel and everything went black. When I came to, the car was still, the engine silent. The storm was gone, the night quiet. I was alone, or so I thought. The scent of rain and that faint floral fragrance filled the car, stronger now, almost suffocating. I turned slowly, dreading what I would see. She was there, sitting in the passenger seat, her eyes locked onto mine. She smiled, a slow, chilling smile that sent a wave of terror through me. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. And then just like that, she was gone. I stumbled out of the car, my heart racing, my mind in a fog. I looked around, but there was no sign of her, no trace that she had ever been there. Just the empty road stretching out before me. But I knew better. She was out there, waiting, and I knew that no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I drove, I would never escape her, the phantom hitchhiker, the vanishing passenger, a ghost of the highway, forever haunting those who dare to travel her road. And now, I was one of them, forever cursed, forever haunted, forever lost on that endless, dark highway.